One day, my mistake, I cut the binding a little wider than I had been. And I said, oh, I'm just going to go with it and see what happens. So instead of wrapping the binding just to the stitching line, I wrapped it as far as it needed to go. And what I found out was that mitering these corners was much, much easier when I had a little extra fabric to hold on to. So let me show you that. This miter, if we look on the front of the quilt, that fold goes that way. So the bulk of this front miter is on this side of the corner. That means we want the back bulk to be over here. So I'm going to lay this back down and look at the back of this quilt again. So that means I need to fold this miter like that and like that, so that the bulk on the back is over on this side and the bulk on the front is over here. So the back bulk is opposite the front bulk. That will give us the smallest amount of bulges in this corner. Now, I almost hate to share this with you, but because of all the bulk in that corner, sometimes people want to get in here and trim a lot of this out. You can make a real mess if you're not really, really careful with that. So the only trimming that I would advise is this little bit right here, where there's a bunch of layers that kind of fold back on themselves. And you can see if you look in like this, that's really hidden in there. That's not anywhere near the front. So if any trimming is to be done, I would just barely nip that little corner off. And just that little bit of a nip will help smooth things out up here up front. You see how nice and smooth that is? Okay, so for hand sewing back here, I'm going to begin. I'm a right-hander, so I'm going to begin sewing this way, and I need to pre-fold that binding on the back so that the back bulk is opposite the front bulk. So I'm going to put that in there like that, and then I'm going to bring this up like this. I guess I'll move that out of the way a wee bit. And these binding clips are fantastic. It beats poking yourself with pins, so I really like these little binding clips like that. And then I will hand sew here. I will hand sew this diagonal here. If it's a competition quilt, I will poke my needle to the front and put a stitch or two in the front miter. If it's not a competition quilt, I don't. I find it very, very difficult to get stitches in there without them showing. And so I skip that unless it's a competition quilt. Judges will check and see if they can get their fingernail under that little diagonal, they might count you down. Speaking of judges, I'm sure that out there somewhere, there's a judge who might count you down if your back binding is a little bigger than your front binding. So if you are concerned about that, rather than cutting your binding 2 1/4 inches, try 2 inches or maybe 2 1/8. But I have been assured by National Quilting Association certified judges that they are not taught to mark down for that. But you and I know somewhere out there there's a judge who might count you down. So just so you know, that's the story. Now, how to hand stitch this. There's a little bit we can do for our hand health. And the first thing I want to comment on is the orientation of the quilt when you are stitching. My non-sewing hand needs to stay in a natural position like this, and then I'm sewing like this. If I were a lefty, I'd be holding the quilt like this and stitching this way. You see the quilt is out away from me. A lot of times I see people doing it like this. And now you see how my non-sewing hand is in a very unnatural position, and that's going to cause me some pain eventually. We don't want that. So please, I know it's a hard habit to break if you've been doing it the other way, but put the quilt out away from you so that your non-sewing hand is in a more natural position. Now, other things we can do for our health, of course, you probably know about a thimble. A thimble is great for pushing the needle so that you don't poke the needle into your finger. That's a wonderful thing. Something you might not already know about is a finger caught. A finger caught goes on the finger that is pulling the needle. So the finger that is pulling the needle, use the finger caught, and you need very, very light pinch on that needle to pull that needle through. And it makes a big difference. It will really save the health of your hand and your arm. And then another is I like to use a finger caught on my non-sewing thumb because it helps me grip this binding here. I need much less pinch strength on that binding in order to get that held in place. So the actual stitching. Let's see, I'm going to start near the corner so I can show you a corner. I peel this binding back, and then I want to do a little back stitch so that if something pulls on that binding, it's not pulling on that knot. So I do this little back stitch like that. And that way, if something pulls on that binding or whatever, you see how that knot is not going to pop through the fabric. The back stitch is taking all of the force there. So I've come up through the backing, and then I am just going to catch a couple of threads of that binding. And I pull that through, and then where this thread comes out of the binding, I go directly into the backing, and then I come up and I grab just a couple of threads of the fold of that binding. Don't pull your stitches too tight or you'll get little dimples. And then in the binding, in the backing, right underneath where it comes out of the binding, and up, catch a couple of threads in the binding, and there we go. Now I'm just going to take a couple of more stitches up into that corner so I can show you how to do the corner. How close together you take these stitches is up to you. Think a moment about what is the use of this quilt. If it's a competition quilt, your stitches should probably be 1/8 of an inch or probably less. If it's a quilt for another reason, whatever you feel like. Be as fussy as you care to be. All right, now I've stitched right up to that miter, and now I'm going to put a couple of stitches in this miter like this. And these don't have to be as close together, and you don't need a whole lot of them. I usually do 2 or 3. Like that. Now, if this was a competition quilt, I would poke my needle to the front, get a couple of stitches in there, and then I would put my needle in, come out right about here, and continue on down that side. And I think you can see how that is going to leave a nice corner on that little quilt, and it's going to be very neat and tidy.